Hello, everyone. Welcome to this discussion around the Digital News Report. As always, and every year, we have a special deep dive on India. It's a big market, very important, both in terms of the trends, in terms of the size of the audience. And of course, this year, in the run-up to the general elections, it's been very, very high octane for newsrooms across the country. It's also been quite interesting in terms of the takeaways we have from the report itself that we do at the Reuters Institute. And this year, again, audience engagement looks like it is fraying, which I think is a really important concern that we're going to talk about. It also looks like there is greater fragmentation in terms of the channels that audiences seem to choose when they are consuming news content. And increasingly so, it looks very apparent that with a few social media platforms, particularly X, formerly Twitter, not that popular in India, Facebook, quite popular in India, there is a considerable waning in terms of engagement around news over there. Of course, as I said, news avoidance remains a big challenge. And for India, particularly because of what has sprung up in the run-up to these elections in terms of digital offerings and YouTube offerings, there's a lot to discuss. We're going to dive straight into it, and I've got a fantastic panel to do that, representative of the digital universe, of course, but of many different parts of it. Seema Chishti, who is editor at The Wire, Rupa Jha, who is CEO and co-founder of the Collective Newsroom that produces and publishes content for BBC News Indian languages, amongst other things, and Pooja Prasanna, who is editorial head at the News Minute. Holding it all together right on top is our author of the Digital News Report, Nic Newman, who has once again done some extensive research around the takeaways for India and for audiences across 47 countries. Nic, I'm going to hand the baton to you to walk us through the big takeaways, and then we'll start discussing it.
Thank you, Mitali. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I'm going to focus on the Indian data, but also try and set it in a global context. This is our 13th digital news report. As Mitali says, we cover 47 markets this year, so it's the biggest we've ever done. It represents in total about half the world's population. And I should just say a few words about the methodology, first of all. Just a reminder, it is based on online polling. And as such, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behaviors such as TV, print, and radio, which are obviously very important in India. But our main focus is digital. I should also stress that the sample, these are largely representative samples. In India, it tends to be a younger, more urban and English-speaking sample. So we should remember that when we think about the results from India in particular. And in terms of the background, it's an independent report. We have 18 different sponsors or supporters. The main sponsor is the Google News Initiative, but we also have the BBC, other broadcasters, publishers, foundations, and academic institutions who support our work every year. And the sample size in India was around 2,000 in the poll that we did. So one of the biggest changes that we're seeing right now is what's going on with tech platforms. And that's partly linked to AI, it's partly linked to changing audience behavior, and it's partly linked to changing strategies of those media companies themselves. And the most obvious example of this is with Facebook, where we see a significant decline in weekly use for finding, sharing, consuming news. And this is part of a deliberate strategy to pull back from news, to pull back from politics, and invest instead in content that it sees as being more engaging for its users, including individual creators and influencers. What you're seeing here is aggregate data for a number of the social and media and video platforms in 12 markets, mainly actually in Western countries. And the other big trend that you can see here is the growth of video networks or visually led networks. So YouTube, Instagram, and across the markets we're looking at, TikTok, these are the big growth areas in the last year. It's also worth pointing out that Facebook and X are also leaning into video much more and prioritizing formats that are designed to keep people within the platforms. So this sort of post and refer model that the media has depended on for, a decade or more is becoming severely diminished even before we get to potential further disruption from artificial intelligence and search. So this chart represents 12 mostly Western countries, but actually we see many of these shifts moving even faster elsewhere and in markets like India. So specifically, if we look at video and we look at YouTube, YouTube on average is used for news by around 31%, but you can see it's much higher than that with our Indian sample. And indeed, the top 10 markets are all in the global south. So this is partly due to I think different cultures, but also due to younger populations in many of these countries as well, really embracing video in a much deeper way. So lots of changes in the platform environment that I think are having an impact on publishers, and we're going to discuss that in the panel. But I think just to frame it, how important is platform consumption anyway, compared with direct consumption? And this is data from all the different markets that we look at, all 47 markets aggregated. And what we're looking at here is the percentage of people who say their main way of starting a news journey, where do they access from? What's their gateway? And across all of these markets, social media is now number 1, search is number 2, and direct is number 3. And direct traffic has been declining every year. Other ways of getting to traffic to media, including mobile alerts, aggregators, and emails, but those are the main 3. But if you look at India specifically, our Indian sample, you can see an even greater reliance on social media and search. So these sort of algorithmically driven ways of accessing news are more powerful and more important, whereas only 11% say that their preferred way of accessing news is to open a news website or an app. So this is really interesting when we think about how do you build direct relationships. We see these differences between countries, and that, of course, will affect the strategies of news companies too. So I've already alluded to the rise of online video, and much of that is being driven by younger audience, but also by changing platform strategies. What does it look like? Now short form video, which has really exploded in many countries in the last few years, 66% of our entire sample say they access short form video, news related video in the last week. And that number again is higher with our urban Indian sample. But it's not just short form, it's long form via YouTube, it's live streams. I mean, much of the barriers in terms of data charges and all the rest of it are diminishing. And this means that we have some of the highest consumption actually in Asian countries, as you can see there. Much lower consumption actually in where I am right now in the UK, where people still seem to prefer to read a lot more, though again, with younger users, we really see this growth in YouTube and TikTok in the UK. So let's look at the main platforms for video news. So if people are consuming video news, where are they consuming it? Again, we're asking each individual to say which of the platforms that they prefer, where they're spending most time. In the Philippines, you can see it's mainly Facebook with a little bit of YouTube. In India, obviously TikTok is banned, so there's even more focus on YouTube as a platform, and Facebook has become much less important. So in terms of video, YouTube is really the sort of key way in which people are accessing that. And then in other countries like Indonesia, you can see how fast TikTok has grown. That's 22%, so almost as many as YouTube in Indonesia. So only in a very few countries do we see most video consumption happening within a website or app of a news media company. Only in Norway, for example, where it's sort of equal to social media. So this challenge for publishers in this shift to video is how do you monetize it, but also how do you build those direct relationships on somebody else's platform, because most video is consumed on somebody else's platform. Why do people like video? So it's partly about trust. So this sort of sense that what you see in video is more believable than what you might read in a traditional newspaper, for example. The sense that it's unedited, it's not colored by agendas or spin from traditional media. Whether we believe this is true or not, this is how many people see it. Convenience. So it's really short and easy to consume, and it's really aligned with your personal interests. So the feeds are very personalized. So it's really relevant to everybody. And then this sense of different perspectives. So people really enjoy the fact that in these aggregated video platforms, you can get literally anything. You can get an amazing range of perspectives. You can go really deep on a specific passion that you care about. And it's that wider definition of news. It's not just sort of narrow news. It's also that broader sense of news that people enjoy. Of course, it's been a really big year for elections around the world. And amid that, we have a lot of concerns, growing concerns about the quality of information, the reliability of information. We ask every year a tracking question, which is, to what extent are you concerned about what's real and fake on the internet when it comes to news? And for the last couple of years, we've seen that number rise in aggregate. So 59% across all 47 countries, that's the average. India is very similar to the average, but in some other countries where we've seen elections, we see much higher levels and increases. So India, South Africa, and United States, we've seen significant increases on last year in terms of people's concern about whether things are true or not and their ability to tell the difference. Of course, part of this is the fear of what might happen with artificial intelligence, this sort of sense that in the last year, our feeds are becoming full of synthetic content, photorealistic images generated by AI, whereas last year it was really easy to spot this. Maybe it's less easy now. And we've talked to a number of respondents in qualitative work we've done this year. And, many of them are now really concerned about what this means. It used to be that we've always been suspicious of text, and we've always sort of read it with a sort of sense of, where's the bias? What can I believe? But we used to believe what we saw in terms of pictures and videos, and we're entering an era where that may not be true anymore. Some platforms are seen as a bigger problem than others. So this is actually data from all countries, and that's why TikTok is at the top, and X. So these are platforms that people are more worried about in terms of whether they can identify trustworthy news on each platform. So TikTok, X, Facebook are the ones that people are most worried about, and they feel that they have more agency within, for example, Google search. It is slightly different in different countries, but it's relatively consistent. And these are also platforms where a lot of misinformation has been spread. I should say that so has WhatsApp, but maybe the trust scores for WhatsApp are slightly better because people feel that they're getting that information from people that they know and trust. Whether that's reliable information or not is a whole nother question. So as well as misinformation, we've also looked at how the media is, how audiences feel about AI being used in news content specifically. And this is because many news publishers are starting to incorporate news AI into their processes and into their production and workflows. So we gave our audiences two scenarios. So one scenario was, how comfortable are you with content that is produced mainly by artificial intelligence, maybe with a bit of human oversight? So essentially the creation is done, maybe, a story is written by artificial intelligence, but it's checked by a human, or it's giving you an answer, a bot is giving you an answer to a query you may have. And in this case, in almost all cases, with the exception of India, the people are very uncomfortable with this. For some reason, which you may be able to explain in the panel, people are more comfortable in India than they are in the UK, 4 times more comfortable. So only 10% say they're comfortable with this scenario in the UK, 42% in India, and 23% in the US. So more people are uncomfortable in the US as well. The second scenario is when humans are in charge. So human journalists are creating content, but AI is used in a supporting role. So that might be translation or transcription or helping with research. And in this case, people in all countries are more comfortable than uncomfortable. So there's more blue than red on this chart. So essentially the strong message here is that, except in India, people really, really want humans to be in control, especially when important stories are at stake. So if it's about elections or crime, this is much more worrying to people than automating sports scores, for example. So that brings me to trust. And trust in the news obviously is a huge issue, and I think will become more important in the era of AI, but it's currently relatively stable. So it hasn't gone down. It's the same as it was last year across all countries. 40% say they trust most news most of the time. It's not a great figure, but it's not gone down. And this year we also looked at, what are the drivers of trust? So what are the factors that mean that people are more likely to trust or distrust a specific news outlet? And it's pretty consistent. I'm just showing you the Asian data here. So this is aggregated across 11 Asian countries, but it's very similar across the whole sample. So the most important thing is that the media is open and transparent, that it has high journalistic standards, but also ethical standards, that there's very little bias or agendas, that people want it to be free from those biases, and that it represents different groups fairly. So these four primary factors are more important than all the other factors. And I think it's really it's very clear what audiences want from news media. And when they score brands low, or they say they don't trust the media, it's because they feel that these ideals are not being met in some way. So they think the media is biased or doesn't represent a particular group fairly, or it's not being transparent, it's hiding things. So at root, these are the most important reasons. What's interesting is that in terms of responses, how do we rebuild trust? A lot of the effort from many media companies is to increase trust markers, to say we're trustworthy because our journalism goes through processes, and to increase the transparency and openness. And one example of that is BBC Verify. So it launched a separate brand in 2023 where it fact checks, but it's also trying to show the workings when it checks, for example, what happened in this Gaza hospital. And what we find in our data is this works quite well with people who already trust the news, but it can often backfire with people who are less trusting already of your particular brand. So we probably need a mixture of different strategies here, rather than there's no silver bullet to how to rebuild trust. So just a couple of other headlines before we get into the discussion. So one of the key challenges, obviously, for media is financial sustainability, particularly in an era when advertising has suffered with an economic downturn. So more media companies are trying to get people to pay for news, either through a subscription, a membership, or donation. And we only really ask about this in 20 countries where we have representative samples and where there is a lot of payment in the market. So these are the 20 countries. And you can see that in some countries, we're really seeing very high levels of payment for online news. So in countries like Norway and Sweden, a third or 4 in 10 are paying an online subscription. Whereas in some bigger markets like the UK, only about 8%. But in all countries, only a minority are prepared to pay. And the subscription growth that we saw during COVID, for example, seems to have leveled out. So there is a real challenge about how we move this forward. So that's sort of that's one side of things. The other challenging aspect of the news right now is declining interest, particularly from hard to reach groups who are becoming less interested in the news, or are actually selectively avoiding the news sometimes or often. So this is a figure we've been tracking since 2017, and it's an aggregate figure across the whole market of all 47 markets. So almost 4 in 10, 39% say that they sometimes or often avoid the news. So they are consuming news, but they're trying to restrict the amount they take in to protect their mental health because it's too negative, a whole range of different reasons. And part of that is linked to fatigue with long-running stories like the war in Gaza or Ukraine. And part of it's about other things as well. And, these are just some of the comments from India specifically this year. So some people feel that there's just too much news, that part of our response is that we're just throwing more and more newsletters and podcasts and videos at people, hoping some of it will stick. So too much news. But also that sense that it's relentlessly one bad thing after another. The media always has this negative frame, this negative agenda. Where is the hope? Where is the sort of sense that there's something I can get involved with. Some people complain about the trust and exaggeration and sensationalism, particularly in India. And then there's that whole question about, can you trust it? Which I think is going to become even bigger issue as we go forwards. I'm confused. All these perspectives that I see in social media from all these different brands, they're all saying slightly different things. I'm confused about whether it's true or whether it's false. So just to finish, maybe 5 points that we can discuss, and Mitali and the rest of you can pick up on. Firstly, that uncertainty in the platform environment. So if it's going to be harder to get referrals and new audiences through social media, how can publishers survive? How can they build direct connections? How can they reduce dependence on these big platforms, which has been such a feature of the last 10 years or so? Video formats are on the rise, but how can media connect with younger audiences in these networks? How can they compete with influencers who quite often take a bigger share of the voice and attention compared with mainstream media? Artificial intelligence. So inherently, in most countries, audiences are skeptical and they have this very strong sense that humans should stay in control. So how do you incorporate the potential efficiency gains that AI could bring without losing public trust? Misinformation, audiences worried about misinformation. Is this actually an opportunity for mainstream media organizations to show its transparency, the processes it goes through, and to rebuild some of that trust? And then the problem of news avoidance, news fatigue. Is there something wrong with the product? Do we need to rethink the product so that it's more engaging, that it's more hopeful, and it's more relevant to audiences? So just a few thoughts from looking at some of the India data and hopefully relating that to global data, and more data freely available from our website. I will stop sharing my screen.
Nic, thank you very much for that. Let me do sort of a retrospective question with you first, and then we'll dive into the discussion. From 2023 to 2024, what did you see as a big change, if any, from the Indian market? And specifically on YouTube, what are the trends emerging, both in terms of younger audiences, which is something we've been tracking, as also partisan content?
Yes, I mean, I think that the big change, I mean, it's like, a lot of changes are kind of gradual, but I do think that what's going on platforms is much bigger, and that's happening in India elsewhere. And it's not just YouTube. It's short form video platforms. Obviously, TikTok is not there, but in India there are a number of sort of similar short form platforms, and it's not just younger people, interestingly, in India. So it's in Western countries like the UK, it's mainly younger people who are engaging in some of this sort of short form video, but actually in India it's much wider than that, I think. So I think the video is one thing, and I suppose the other challenges are around in the Indian market is just the huge range of options, and the huge range of free options, which means to be really truly distinctive and to stand out, you have to really build that relationship with a very specific audience, because general news is just so abundant.
Thank you for that, Nic. Seema, maybe we'll start off with you. It's been a big couple of months with the elections, and there's been a lot anecdotally discussed about YouTube as a platform, about where the audiences were shifting, where the journalism was shifting. What are your own reflections in terms of what worked or didn't as a digital outfit?
So for me, I mean, what's of concern, even seeing what you had to offer by way of your survey, is the platform interface still remains key. So the fact that people aren't directly coming to the website is a matter of concern, that there's something in behavioral changes. So however much I jazz up our website and make it good, respectable, people aren't being driven there. So that bit of the pipeline worries me. And also, I think this trust in video, as you know, India has the highest number of people who are watching short-term videos. This is also borne out by phone data, and cheap data in India has made that possible, that people are just watching short videos. So the ability to kind of convey complex points through that is a problem. Speaking of the elections, we had a very interesting observation made by Yogendra Yadav, who said that there was just a 1% vote share difference between Mr. Modi being in government and in being in the opposition. And as per his analysis of some excellent post-poll data by the Center for Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, he thought that if people who are watching TV, if 1 in 66 Indians had changed their minds, it would have swung the result. Now, it's a very dramatic kind of a conclusion that the political scientist Yogendra Yadav has come to. But I think that just drove home the fact that big media still matters. But to the extent that YouTube offered an avenue for people coming up to kind of counter things, to speak about it, to raise issues which otherwise had no hope in hell in mainstream media, I think YouTube has really kind of changed the game this time around. I hesitate to call it a YouTube election because that has a way of minimizing it kind of shrinks the enormity of the politics that may have gone in there. But I think as people in India were even using YouTube to just search, so more than Google, a Google search bar, they were searching things on YouTube. So I think that way it has really kind of, been the wheels of information and changed and helped counter a huge bias in big media that we've seen in the run-up to the election. Those are my preliminary thoughts.
Pooja, two-part question to you, because the News Minute has a very strong focus on the southern Indian markets and, has a great presence there. What have you observed in terms of audience trends? That's one. And whether you think it's a bit different from, what you may be hearing from colleagues around the rest of India. And the other, this approach of collaboration, which is something that smaller digital platforms like yours did, of course, around the big electoral bond story, but then in the general election coverage as well. So was there a difference, or do you sense there's a difference in the southern Indian market? And B, have collaborations seen something quite tangible as an outcome for outfits like yours?
I'll address your second question first. And I think my co-panelists would agree with me that the collaborations did, put forth something that we haven't seen before, because we've seen how organizations are extremely competitive, and that has increasingly become counterproductive. This time we pooled in our resources, and like you said, we have a presence in South India. That's our expertise. We tend to say that we know South better than others, but there are parts of the country that we don't understand as well as the wire, Newslaundry. So when we put our heads together, I think we could convince the audience to quite an extent that we're giving you something that others don't. And by coming together, in fact, it's an experiment that we've never seen, because news channels have become so competitive that it's almost, it's destructive. Here, we actually showed, the kind of positive coming together, where we're not competing with each other, we're learning from each other. And that did help, put together a more holistic perspective of what's happening, because we had ground reports from remote areas in the south, we had something from the northeast, something from the north. So in terms of resources also for smaller newsrooms, it's very helpful, because we're pooling in our resources, manpower, feet on street, all of it, which means that it acts as a force multiplier. And our audiences also come together, because yes, there are some overlaps, but at the end of the day, we are looking at, if not 5x, but somewhere in between, say 3 to 4x multiplication of our audience. So both in terms of quality and quantity, I think it was a great experiment.
Rupa, let me come to you on some of the points that were raised by Pooja, because you've been part of the BBC News team as well. Fact checking was a part of the content that you were, working on there. Have you seen this trend in terms of video consumption grow over the years, and in what shape and form? And second, would you say misinformation is specifically a problem that is larger in the Indian context, and that is also limited to social media? Or would you say it's a reflection of what biases might be present in society itself?
So coming to the first question, I think nothing in this report, which we all wait for. Thank you, Nic, for doing this yet again excellent insight into how this digital world is changing or not changing. Actually, nothing surprised me except for the fact that news avoidance percentage is not is almost similar to the last report. It's just first 4% change. Because we have seen that in India specifically, and I've been all along my professional life, I've worked in the digital space in India specifically, and I've seen that video has been the main, vehicle of growth. If I talk about BBC Indian languages, regional languages that I operate in, Hindi, Marathi, Tamil, Telugu, Gujarati, Punjabi, all these major markets, they have been very, very video-led market. So I am not surprised to see that, it continues even when we don't have TikTok, which is a short form video platform, but, Insta is extremely popular. In fact, in our own assessment of audience insight, Mitali, BBC focuses a lot on YouTube because the attribution for the content is 5 times bigger on YouTube than on any other platform. So in that sense, it's most reliable platform for a publisher, because at least you get your content attribution. People understand when they watch something that, okay, this is BBC or this is Wire or different publishers. The attribution is very high. The recent analysis of our own content, which I can share with you, has been that earlier we were too obsessed with the short form. And yes, I know that we agree with the assessment that your report brings, Nic, that short form video has really taken us by storm. But what is also interesting, what we are saying, and we are very, very video-led, video-first strategy we have in this newsroom, which is serving BBC. Is the long form video. Actually, we have seen that how much people have, especially during elections, really enjoyed our long form, which is like, 15, 20, 30 or 50-minute videos where people have really engaged and they have stayed on, especially the loyal audiences. So we are slightly shifting our, strategy in terms of, we were earlier very, very wary of not putting anything more than 7 minutes because the watch time would be only 6 minutes on YouTube. But we are experimenting and we are getting good results, that people are those who are discerning. And if it is aligned to the mission, to the identity of your channel, that what is it that you are providing to the people who are coming to you, then long text and long videos are also giving us good numbers now. Especially in Hindi market, I can tell you that text is still holding the fort. It's not just video, which of course we know that is leading the growth story, but long text and insightful text are also doing quite good with the loyal audiences, with news connoisseurs, of course. Now, your second question was, Mitali, about fake news. Yes, BBC has always kind of focused on tackling with fake news and misinformation. We did a in-depth analysis of India and Kenya market. I don't think it's solely specific to India. Africa also, has a huge issue of misinformation. But yes, India, we have it, and probably it has become a new normal. And therefore, I'm not surprised that people in India have said that, okay, we don't mind AI, dealing with the news, because they have had such bad experience with human beings delivering news for them. So I guess they want to trust artificial intelligence. But yes, it's a huge issue. In fact, Seema shared with me, one of a very so-called respected YouTuber came out with a big fake news that, okay, BBC has come out with the result with exit poll that how India bloc is going to win, and massive. Of course, it has nothing to do with what ultimately the results came out. And it had BBC News logo. It had Ravish Kumar, who's a very popular YouTuber, leaning towards, anti-establishment, so to say. And it went in millions. 27 million in few hours. So it is a huge issue. And my biggest worry as a journalist is nothing else but the fact that, this whole trust in information has been completely corroded. And that means that, you have kind of scramble the circuit which holds democracy. And that is my biggest worry when I am in this profession and I see it day in, day out. So we do struggle with fake news, misinformation, and every time we have to kind of while we're doing stories. And I think how as publisher, how we are dealing with it is, again, as you said, that video brings in that kind of sense of authenticity, that this will not be fake. I think doing journalism from the ground has really been, once again, proven that it's so important to be out there on the ground. Yes, it is expensive, and yes, it is not possible for all media houses to do it, or few media houses choose not to do it. But I think we are putting our bet behind, putting more and more resource behind going out on the ground and doing journalism from the ground. is what my experience has been, has really gained our audiences back.
Seema, let's talk about audiences for a little bit. Part of the challenge, and that's not unique to India, is what to do with this fraying relationship with younger audiences. It's also sort of a fact that in the run-up to the elections, a lot of the content remained what it traditionally has, which is, general news reportage, updates on particular, evolving political stories. How do you align that with the fact that younger audiences are moving away from that format and the fact that younger audiences could be turning to platforms like YouTube or even Instagram, as the case seems to be in India, where it's not necessarily a journalist who's sharing information, but someone who we would, at this point in time, define as an influencer?
Yeah, that's like really concerning. So there are two dimensions, I think, of that. One is, of course, a commercial dimension. So, we're done in if a lot of this is like almost a version of paid news then. That if I, as a kind of an influencer, is pushing people to use certain kinds of toothpaste or cosmetics or books or whatever, that's a problem. But I think a bigger problem is just purveying even an extreme form of what is correct news, which is not news really, which is opinion, which is like very skewed analysis. And in fact, Joyjeet Pal and a few people have a kind of report, his team has a report on the disappearing middle ground. And again, the elections are still weighing on our minds. Why there was a lot of concern about how things were going was because typically you have a sense of the center news, i.e., which is completely bourgeois outlets, whatever, they're not like committed. But just randomly, if you read about 300 reports, you get a sense of what's going on. With the kind of polarized, this influencer, this YouTube, while it's very good, but I always feared that I hope that people on both sides aren't just like, careening off the table and they've fallen off because they've just gone so extreme. So the absence of a center, which I think a kind of a job that the BBC does still in the UK, despite all the criticism it gets, I think missing that like nobody's business in today's world now. So, and this is kind of proven by how we see influencers and people having to take more and more extreme positions, even sensible people with correct news. But I have to be sharper, more bitter, put in like more masala in order to get views. So I think that's like a problem. I just had two questions, slightly related, but slightly also not directly related. Nic, and to you, Mitali, what are you doing about adjusting for the fact that this is an election year to account for trust in news and news avoidance not going down? Also, I think long videos, I hope, is not a function of the fact that people are interested in news, because you've seen that, I think your Argentinian figures bear that out, that there's a sudden slump after the news. So how much of this is because of the elections that, our whole take on news this year, following your report, may be all skewed because there are these significant elections across these countries?
Nic, do you want to take that?
Yeah, it's very hard to separate out what the election effect is from a whole load of other things, the ongoing things. And quite often in the past, we saw really big election effects. So in the US, for example, when Trump was elected, we saw this sort of huge bump in consumption and interest and also use of social media. This time around, we're seeing a sort of mini bump, much smaller one. So I think generally elections don't have quite the impact that they used to, partly because a lot of people, becoming disconnected from politics. But that may be different in India. And I think part of the value of doing this every year is that we should be able to see these changes in non-election years. So we try and take that into account and interpret it in some way.
But you raise an important point, Seema, particularly around YouTube and the fact that more and more content needs to, by virtue of this, building of a personal connection, become more and more partisan in content as well. Pooja, the other chunky item for you is what's happening with business models. As we know, with India, particularly with mainstream media, a large part of it is now owned by very, very large corporates and business houses, which is not the case for independent media. Is there an evolving sense of what is a durable model, whether you're looking at audience subscriptions or you're looking at philanthropic funding? Is there something that's beginning to stick together for the smaller outfits that are not owned by or funded by, large corporates?
Yeah, most of us are increasingly relying on subscription, revenue, because at the end of the day, we've realized that it may not pay us dividends immediately, but we're here for the long run. So even any kind of dependence on advertisers will eventually tie us down in how independent we can be. We've seen that happening. For example, in different contexts, Patanjali, one of the biggest advertisers for many Hindi platforms, if you're reporting on them, then how do you take money from them, and what about the trust, right? Can people really trust you when you are seen taking money from these corporates? So these are things that we've weighed, and we've realized that in the long run we will have to depend only on subscribers, members, whatever different terms we're all using, and we have been moving in that direction. That also means less dependence on SEO. Let's not forget, at the end of the day, one of the statistics that I saw was that the algorithm-driven search engine is one of the main, that's where most of the people are getting the information from. That again means that you're giving power to somebody else. In this model, it means that you're doing good work. Your audience/reader appreciates the work that you're doing, and they will pay you for your good work. It doesn't mean that everything gets a certain number of clicks. You don't have to do those clickbaity pieces. You don't have to worry about SEO and the headlines. So more number of independent outlets like the News Minute are heading in that direction. And we're working on generating content that will engage with our consumers. For a lack of a better word, I'm using the word consumer here. But what we're also doing is we're engaging them in many different ways. We have programs for them so they can interact with us directly. We have these meetings where they can come and tell us what they think. So these are certain perks that we're giving to make them more involved in the process of keeping news organizations independent. It's not a one-way street. You're as much part of this journey. And it's not a donation, mind you. You're investing in independent journalism. That's the message we are driving home. If I can just have a quick question, I was very curious to see what is the percentage for India. I saw that for the UK and US. What is the percentage of people who are willing to pay for news in India? I seem to have missed that
I don't think
number.
they've surveyed India on that. I didn't find India on the graph.
Yeah, we don't ask it, and we don't ask it partly
not
because
surveyed India. Yeah.
We don't ask it because partly the sample is much more education urban, so we would get a number that would be unrealistic. So I think we're going to have to think of other ways of, and I don't know if you have industry data on this, but of course it's something that everyone wants to know, right? What proportion of the population? It's really hard to do through online polling, I think. And I haven't seen reliable information about it. And obviously, over time, we'll try and get to a position where we can get that data from India, because I think it's important. But I think that the general trend is really interesting. What we're seeing is that the big companies are trying to charge for and are having some success, and I think that will be the case in India as well. But then what you're also getting is these very more specific audiences where you really know your audience. You're trying to build that closeness and connection that you were talking about, and that doesn't scale in the same way, but it's still a really, really interesting model, I think, for local news and for specialist news and for other purposes.
Seema, do you want to add to that? Because it's a bit sort of boundary in India, isn't it? Where you do have paywalls for large groups like the Times of India, but the numbers are probably coming into these standalone journalists on digital media platforms like YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, I really have a different point of view. And I think that way the Wire is an outlier in that sense that I think that for the kind of news that we claim to do and we want to do, which is a public good, there is no subscription model. The only model will have to be donations in some way. Otherwise, you'll have you'll have several walled gardens. You'll have good, authentic news for those who can pay. You tend to do more news of those who can pay, would pay more for. And for the rest, there is fake news. So that for me is like really worrying. And it's more of a question rather than like I don't have an answer. So the Wire, we kind of work to like very stripped down models, very basic ones. But I think that's the cost of news as a public good. And I think that's something which I don't know, maybe Maria Ressa has thought more about it. You all have thought more about it. But that, I think, is something we really need to think about. The role of news in today's democracy. Can we put a price tag on it? And Rupa used a very evocative phrase, which I want to steal from her. I'll steal the copyright sometime, about scrambling the entire circuitry. It's a Wired phrase. Circuitry on which democracy rests. So I think if information and public information, publicly available in public interest, How do you sustain it? So I get why, Newslaundry, News Minute are doing subscriptions, but I don't know if that's the answer. And I mean, so the why we've concluded that. So for me, that's like a huge question, that will we ever be able to scale it up to that? So even if Al Jazeera, they've got Mr. Thani doing the financing, BBC has the license fee, we have just donors. So I think it'll just have to be somebody will have to pay, because it's good for the health of the economy, the country, and democracy. Just subscribers may just completely skew the whole who's the news for and what am I doing eventually with it?
No, I do. I just, no, it's a very valid point, and we do struggle with this quite often, when we decide on which story goes behind the paywall. In many cases, what we've done over a period of time, we think that, okay, we've put a story behind the paywall for a week, and after that, we will, bring it out and make it accessible to everybody. That's one formula we've found. But other than that, anything that we think is in public good, we don't put it behind a paywall. We put our long format that we think is probably for a niche audience. We put that behind a paywall, and again for a short while, and then we bring it out. But when we say subscribers, we say that, okay, you get these benefits, but news is for everybody. So, it's, again, like I said, it's almost like you're investing a small chunk in independent journalism. So it's not just because it's not transactional. Okay, I get this one paywalled access to this one paywalled story, so I pay. That's one part of it. But also overall, we're trying to open it up as well.
But there's a third leg for the Indian market. I mean, one is, concerns around funding and keeping these news organizations thriving financially. The other is, of course, disengagement with audiences. But then there's the third side, which is very, very onerous laws, some of which we saw come into some shape and form, or at least suggested form over the last year. Sometimes they are paired with other laws such as UAPA, which is an anti-terrorist law, and go on to sort of discredit many of the active journalists, many of those who run news organizations. Do you find that it sort of stymies the effort for news organizations even more, that it makes it more difficult in terms of audience engagement? Or do you believe audiences have a sense of the fact that there is quite a bit of state pushback against any content that is critical of them?
I would like to believe the later point, because that has been our experience, that, of course, we know that how media freedom is being stifled, and every day there's new law or something being changed, and more it becomes difficult to operate independently. So independent media in Indian context seems like a false news now, to be very honest. We saw what happened with NewsClick. Continuously we're seeing sedition laws or UAPA, as you rightly said. So doing journalism independently, doing courageous journalism has been a very tough task, and kudos to people who are not backed by big media organization, and yet they're doing very, very brave journalism. And I think both Pooja and Seema, their teams are really, I really admire what they do, because BBC has a slightly different positioning in all of it. But I think, yes, doing journalism, independent journalism, credible journalism has not remained easy, to be honest. But I feel that, audiences see through it. They see through it that what this government is trying to do, or they are kind of stopping things which are not in their favor. This is what I would like to believe, and this has been my experience as well. I'll tell you just small experience of BBC in India. Like, of course, there was a tax survey, and after the documentary that came out, and then there were so many coverage by mainstream media that BBC avoided tax, so on and so forth. And we did, after all of it, there was an audience analysis. The survey that BBC did, that have we lost trust in audience? So there was a little bit dip around that period when all these news was coming around, and then it shot up again. So I think that people do see through it. I don't know what Seema and Pooja have to say, but I do feel that they see through it ultimately, no?
I think it also bears mentioning that for many audiences, it is the gating of information that is quite damaging. In states like Mizoram and earlier in Punjab, India holds the distinction of having the most internet shutdowns worldwide. So a lot of times when information is really vital, it's actually gated to people who could benefit from it, and it's frankly dangerous. Seema, Nic and I are both intrigued by the AI observation and why Indians tend to give it so much more faith. And it's doubly ironic in a situation where it was Google's Gemini and its India episode where Prime Minister Modi indicated to have fascist-like tendencies, and then Google decided to do nothing around electoral content. What do you make of this audience and AI relationship?
So I think India, very, very not surprised at all for what Indians did. Indians have a love for this technology dashboard. Either, I mean, you could, if I was a sociologist, I would say that maybe because a system's failure is seen. So for the same reason you like a messiah, or you like somebody to fix it, Mr. Fix It or Miss Fix It, or you love the machine because the machine is going to be, if it's a calculator, it'll give me the right answer. If it's an EVM, which is what we rode on in early days of the EVM, it's a machine. It's not a human being. It's not driven by caste, class, other considerations, biases, and prejudices. So there's a bit of this this lovely rolling dashboard, this Star Trek type rolling counters. Indians love it. So similarly, it's AI, and it's kind of gives us magical thinking, artificial intelligence, rather than the large language model that this is. I think this is like a second part on what you said about the government, because the government had been gung-ho on AI. In fact, Mr. Modi has a very interesting habit of using words that would show up almost like hashtag loaded kind of comments when he's speaking to influencers and all that. And he'd always make it a point to drop in artificial intelligence to signal modernity, new India, take you forward, etc., all of that. So, but that was like a rude shock when this happened. And there was some crazy memo that came out. The then IT minister, Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar, came out with something. There were discussions held, and maybe Google had its ears kind of pulled up a bit, but how dare you deliver these answers? And they had to scale back, and they had to rename it. I think the renaming may not have happened because of that, but it would have fed the information about Google having to quickly take cover. So I think that's they would like machine stuff, but they would like machine to completely adhere to prejudice. So that love of government for machines is because you think you can regulate it better. But I think this fancy that Indians have for machines stems from a sense that maybe it'll be less biased, and it's the love for gizmos.
But just a point here, Mitali, it could be that, right now, we have not seen what it really means to have AI do your, journalism. I do feel that, markets like US and UK, they are far advanced in terms of media advancement and how people they consume and what they want from media. I do feel that we are at a stage where people also want to experiment and see, let's see what this brings in. I do feel that sense of curiosity and experiment is there, and because, to be honest, we have also failed our consumers. Media has failed our consumers in India massively. So they think, what will be worse than this, that every time, as I told you, that mainstream media or so many established media houses just coming out and just churning out misinformation and not even apologizing for that. There's a trend, and there's no etiquette around it. You make mistake and you kind of you apologize because you could make mistake. So I also feel that it is that maybe we don't know what we are asking for, that they want to test it.
Pooja, any cool experiments happening at the News Minute? I know Scroll is sort of working a bit with AI on how to use it to support journalists more than anything.
We just try and, in small parts here and there, for example, our social media strategy, we try and see if we can pull it out of AI. And then, we tweak it, of course, going forward. But we trying it out in smaller portions. But headlines, for example, can we tweak it a little bit using AI? Nothing larger than this. But I just to add to what I agree with both Seema and Rupa. But we're not very cynical when it comes to machines, I feel. For example, when we talk about data privacy, when we do stories on how your data is being collected and you're not even being told, the kind of responses I get, I don't know how to react. What's the big deal, so what if they're taking your biometrics?
Absolutely.
So this is an extension of that, I feel. We're not as scared of machines, technology, as much as we are about human beings. And journalists, I think, are also to blame for this largely. We have eroded so much trust that people think that machines could probably be better than us. So yeah.
Nic, final word with you, because we don't want to end on a despondent note. What emerges from your conversations and, of course, the work that you've done on sort of paths to explore further? Video is working. We can see that there are sort of little spots of engagement with audiences and young audiences. What's the spaces to sort of go deeper with?
Yes, that was fascinating, by the way. I really loved uncovering what might be behind these differences around AI. Yeah, I mean, I think partly because of AI, I think this issue of trust is just going to become much more important over the next few years, and how journalism distinguishes itself from this mass of information and disinformation that's available on the internet. And I think people are confused. They find it really hard to navigate. So they are looking for something better, and that's probably why they like the AI and they like some of your media companies that they feel they can identify with. But I think the other thing is really just generally how do we take advantage of this new era and create content that is more relevant to people, that has a better tone of voice, that really connects with people, rather than sort of the old formal way of doing journalism that is really missing a lot of what audiences want, I think. And that's partly agenda, it's partly formats, it's partly tone. But it's definitely being audience focused and really, really understanding who you're talking to and why and how to address their needs.
Sure.
Completely out of time. Pooja, Rupa, Seema, thank you so much for joining in. Nic, thanks as always for presenting the takeaways. Lots, I think, to chew over. And it's been a really, really big year for India, for newsrooms at any rate. Thank you all for joining in with your perspective today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.